This is Paul Hurt at Arizona State University interviewing Ann Castle on March 26th of 2018 at Arizona State University. The interview is for the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program. Ann, thank you so much for joining us today and doing this interview.
Thanks for having me.
Could you please start by telling us your name and the positions that you held in the Adaptive Management Program and the years in which you participated?
Sure. My name is Ann Castle, and I was the Secretary's designee and the chair of the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Work Group for the whole time that I was employed at the Department of the Interior, which was from the middle of 2009 through the end of 2014.
Great. And we've divided up the Adaptive Management Program into three main categories: scientific research, policy and management, and then social engagement and institutional engagement. Would you say you were involved in all of them or some of them? Which categories did you spend most of your time working in?
Well, I would say I was involved in all of them. And I'm not sure that I could identify one that I spent more time in than the others. We were certainly involved in the scientific processes that were going on in conjunction with the AMWAG's work through the Grand Canyon Monitoring and Research Center, GCMRC. That was a center of the U.S. Geological Survey, and I, as part of my position at Interior, I oversaw the USGS. And so the Grand Canyon Monitoring and Research Center was part of my portfolio in that sense, but that scientific group worked very, very closely with the AMWAG to provide scientific data and analysis that could then shape the operations of Glen Canyon Dam to preserve or improve the environment downstream in the Grand Canyon. So there was the scientific component. The cultural component was also very significant, particularly in connection with the participation of the Indian tribes in the AMWAG, and the tribal members of the AMWAG were expressing the positions and concerns of their tribal communities with the operations of Glen Canyon Dam and the effect that those operations were having downstream, and things like archaeological sites that were being exposed by wind erosion and how to deal with those, the treatment of non-native fish, particularly in the upper part of the Grand Canyon and in Glen Canyon itself, and the impact of all of the operations on endangered fish species. Those were all significant concerns of the tribes, and we were constantly working to figure out how to accommodate the desires of the tribes and at the same time fulfill all the other missions and responsibilities of the federal agencies in connection with the operations of the dam. So that's scientific and cultural, and then policy around water balance and water responsibilities was maybe the driving force, because that the water obligations of the upper basin of the Colorado River to the lower basin is the biggest factor determining how Glen Canyon Dam operates. And so fulfilling those responsibilities while taking into account the concerns of all the various stakeholders was really what the Adaptive Management Program was all about.
Yeah, let me drill down a little bit more on your duties as the Secretary of Interior designee. It occurs to me that the Secretary of Interior stands over all of the federal agencies, so many of them that are, involved in this project, like Bureau of Reclamation, which manages Glen Canyon Dam, the National Park Service, where the Grand Canyon National Park,
Right.
is right below the dam. We've got the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We have the BIA and tribal relations. All of those, in a sense, you weren't representing any one of them. You sort of had to manage the relationships between all of them as the person representing the Department of Interior. Can you talk a little bit about your role at that level?
Absolutely, and that was a significant issue during the time that I was at Interior and was the Secretary's designee on the AMWAG. When I first came to Interior, there was number one, a lawsuit among the various AMWAG members. The Grand Canyon Trust was suing the Bureau of Reclamation and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service over the operation of Glen Canyon Dam. So we had litigation within the AMWAG, and the federal agencies were not on the same page. And I started at Interior in July of 2009, and the first AMWAG meeting that I chaired was in August of 2009. So I had a lot to learn during that month. But previously, during 2009, there had been significant discord between the National Park Service and several of the other interior agencies connected with decisions within the AMWAG and the operation of Glen Canyon Dam. There's a lot of history there. The Assistant Secretary for Water and Science, my position, oversees the Bureau of Reclamation and the USGS. There's another Assistant Secretary that oversees the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service, the two other major federal agencies that were involved in the AMWAG. There was even concern when I first started within the federal agencies that it was assumed that the Assistant Secretary for Water and Science would chair the AMWAG and not the Assistant Secretary for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And there was that level of distrust and controversy among those agencies. So, when administrations change and new people come in, they have the disadvantage of not having the history, but I think in that particular case, it was an advantage for me because I didn't have any history with the Park Service, good or bad. And so they couldn't assume that I was going to act in ways that were detrimental to their interests. And I certainly tried not to do that. We tried to coordinate the positions of the 5 different interior agencies that were involved in the AMWAG, and started having pre-meeting meetings among just the federal agencies to talk through the agenda and figure out what everybody was thinking and what the different agencies were worried about or wanting to promote, and coordinating our position. Because previously the federal agencies, there are 5 of them involved. One of those is USGS. The other 4 are designated members of the AMWAG. So Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, Bureau of Indian Affairs, and Reclamation are all members, and we're all voting members of the AMWAG at the time that I started. And they would sometimes vote differently, which I felt was inappropriate. And I wanted to ensure that the federal agencies spoke with one voice on the Amway, that we had discussed and understood the positions of the various different agencies and figured out a way that we could move forward in a coordinated manner. Because it was also true that because the federal agencies were following different paths, some of the Amway members, the other non-federal members, were exploiting those differences and, encouraging discord in order to impede progress.
Now, I know you may be reluctant to talk more specifically about this, but I think for the administrative history, it would be helpful for future listeners to put a little bit of meat on those bones, in the sense that you're talking about an important procedural means for gaining some policy coherency among the federal agencies. Could you talk at least in some detail about what issues you were most deeply involved in that required this extra effort at coordinating positions and policies?
Yeah, well, there were a number of different examples. It's, I think, of public record that in 2008 there was a high flow release from Glen Canyon Dam on an experiment to hopefully stir up sediment from the bed of the river, and with the high flows deposit that sediment higher than it otherwise would have gone on the banks of the river to replenish some of the sandbars that previously existed that had been eroded away by just sort of normal operations of both the dam and just normal function of the river. Several high flow experiments had been done before that, but there was one done in late 2008, so just before the change of administration. The Secretary of the Interior at the time, Dirk Kempthorne, came to that high flow release and was espousing the position of the Department of the Interior that this was something that was being done to further the science, to improve the ecosystem, to replenish camping beaches, to improve recreation. And he was giving a press conference to that effect. And as I understand it, I wasn't there, but I've been told that about 100 or 200 feet away, the superintendent of Grand Canyon National Park was also giving a press conference undermining the value of the high flow experiment. And so that was at a time when this litigation was ongoing, the Grand Canyon Trust suing the other two federal agencies. The National Park Service was, I should stop there. Grand Canyon National Park was supporting the litigation of Grand Canyon Trust against the other federal agencies. There was significant discord. So that was one of the issues that we had to deal with. Others were less high profile, but things like USGS, the Grand Canyon Monitoring and Research Center arm of USGS, was trying to do science in the canyon around the impact of flows on vegetation. So they were looking at vegetation within the range of fluctuation of the releases from Grand Canyon Dam and comparing that vegetation to vegetation that's unaffected by operations, and seeing what they could learn about the impact of dam operations on vegetation. Well, in order to do scientific research in the park, you have to get a Park Service permit. And the Park Service was denying those permits to USGS because they were concerned about part of the park is a wilderness area, and they were worried that the impact of the scientific crews was inconsistent with wilderness values. That was one of the concerns. there were studies that were approved by the AMWAG, things like one I recall was called the Nearshore Ecology Study. That was a scientific study over, I believe, a 3-year period where they were looking at what fish were present and breeding in various locations up and down the river, including backwaters and back channels and tributaries. And so trying to get a handle on where the endangered fish species are living and breeding, where the trout are, just to get a better feel for how these different fish communities are living in the canyon. And of course, the ultimate goal was to figure out how they're impacted by operations of the dam and might be benefited by different types of operations. So the Nearshore Ecology Study involved electrofishing at night. What that means is you have boats in the river with great big lamps shining bright light into the river and attracting the fish. And they put a big ball, metal ball that conducts electricity into the water and shock the water. And that brings the fish to the surface. You scoop them up. Some were dissected, some were just examined and tagged and put back into the river. Well, you got boats roaring around at night with bright lights and a whole bunch of scientists doing stuff in a wilderness area, and usually in the Park Service's non-motor season, because Grand Canyon National Park has a season for motorboats and they have a season when no motorboats are allowed. So that whole scientific operation gave the Park Service a lot of heartburn, and they had to permit it. And so there was tension between the AMWAG and Grand Canyon National Park, between USGS and the park, over those kinds of things that were, everybody's trying to do their mission, and they have different missions. Those different agencies have different responsibilities. And it was a source of controversy that could be allowed to fester and be exploited, or what we tried to do was to get the people in a room together and figure it out and put limits on the scope of the activities that were of concern, and to allow the science to take place, but in a way that was minimally disruptive to the values of the park.
Were the tribal representatives involved in that conversation at all? Because I know some of them have expressed misgivings about these kinds of, shocking programs
right.
on fish.
The involvement of the tribal representatives and in the communities that they represented was mostly around the control of non-native fish. Not so much, at least I don't remember, that it was around these scientific investigations. But because of the cold water releases from Glen Canyon Dam, a wonderful world-class gold medal, blue ribbon, whatever you want to call it, trout fishery has grown up in the reach of the river just below the dam. And Arizona Game and Fish stocked it with trout for years and years and years. Maybe they still do. But turns out trout eat humpback chub, and all the federal agencies are obligated to avoid jeopardy to endangered species. And the humpback chub is an endangered species in the Colorado River. And so the scientific evidence and recommendation at the time that I started with the AMWAG was to control non-native fish, which means kill trout. And, it sounds To an outsider, it sounds kind of barbaric, but as I understand it, game and fish departments all over the country have been using these same kinds of methods for fish control for centuries, not that long, decades. And what they do is they electroshock the fish, and in this case, they're not tagging them and throwing them back, they're killing them. And the object is to reduce numbers, and that was being done in the Grand Canyon to reduce trout numbers in an effort to give the humpback chub babies, especially, a better chance.
Do you think there was any results from that research during the time that you were involved in Amway? Did you get results that led to actual decision making about releases or other forms of management?
Yeah, that was starting to happen toward the end of my time at the Interior Department. And it was so interesting because for me, it was such a lesson in traditional ecological knowledge by the tribes. And it's kind of a long story, but I'll tell you how I learned, what I learned and how I learned it. So the scientific consensus at the time that I started was trout eat chub. We got non-native trout. We're trying to preserve the native endangered species. We need to get the trout numbers down. And so the Bureau of Reclamation, being the operational agency, they were carrying out non-native fish control, meaning that they would they'd usually hire Arizona Game and Fish or some fish agency to go out and electroshock the fish. The tribes, most particularly the Pueblo of Zuni, objected to that procedure because to them, the entire Grand Canyon is a sacred place. And to the Zuni, the confluence of the Colorado River and the Little Colorado River is their place of immersion from the underworld, and it's a particularly sacred place. Well, that's where the humpback chub are in the Little Colorado River, and that's where the most concentration of trout control was being employed. So the Pueblo of Zuni objected forcefully to that practice because the taking of life in a sacred place is anathema, and the fish control was taking the life of the trout. And it was, at the time, I thought it was like a perfect law school exam because the federal agencies are bound by law to avoid jeopardy to endangered species. The scientific consensus is, in order to fulfill that responsibility, you must control the trout numbers, and here's how you do it. The Fish and Wildlife Service was saying that. They're the protectors of endangered species, and they were saying, you got to control the trout. And the tribes, to whom all of those agencies owe a trust obligation, they were saying, you can't do that in our sacred cultural space. And so it was a very difficult dilemma. I went to the Pueblo of Zuni and met with the tribal council and the tribal elders to try to see what we could do. It was not a particularly productive meeting. They were pretty mad at me. I think they were glad I came, but we didn't reach any sort of solution or even a consensus on a path forward. But one of the things they said to me was, one of the tribal religious elders said, you're saying trout eat chub. Well, chub eat chub. These fish have existed together for decades. Why do you have to interfere? Big fish eat little fish. That's just the way things happen. At the time, my scientific buddies were saying, well, yeah, but trout eat chub in greater numbers than chub eat chub. And so you got to control the trout. As my time with the AMWIG went on, the scientific consensus started to turn. And toward the end, the scientists at the Grand Canyon Monitoring and Research Center were saying, trout eat chub, big fish eat little fish, but we don't know if the predation of trout on chub has an effect at the population level. So we know there's this interaction, but we don't know if it has a population effect. And that's what we're interested in, is the population effect. And at the time I thought, that's what the elders were saying. And yet the scientific community had a very hard time figuring out a way to formally incorporate tribal ecological knowledge into their regimen. And I think that's still a source of discomfort in the scientific community. So anyhow, that was a big deal while I was at Interior. One of the things that we did during that time was we did an environmental assessment on non-native fish control, and the tribes were very much involved in that. They didn't like the first result that the federal agencies came up with. We had some sort of facilitated process to try to get everybody's opinions on the table and to get them to work together to come up with a solution that everybody could live with. And at the end of the day, we finally came up with something that seemed to work. While that process was ongoing, the scientific community hadn't yet changed its mind, and they were still saying, we think we need to electroshock the trout. But there were things that were agreed to, like, we'll try to avoid it. We'll really try to avoid doing it at the confluence of the Colorado and the Little Colorado. If we have to do it, we're going to talk to you about what we do with those fish. We'll investigate live removal, which means you scoop them up and you helicopter them out, which is really expensive. But Bureau of Reclamation said, we'll investigate that. And if that is just not feasible, we're going to work with you to figure out how we can deal with the dead fish in a way that honors them. For example, use it for fertilizer on tribal agricultural lands, or something like that. So that was all in the environmental assessment, and that was ultimately something that seemed to work for most of the parties involved. But they've never done another electroshock since that, as far as I know, since that environmental assessment process started and the science was evolving.
What year did that start? Do you remember?
I'm going to say 2011, but I may not have that right. It's plus or minus a year.
And did they ever do the studies to show whether the trout predation on the chub had an effect on the chub populations?
Well, they were trying to do those studies. Yeah, and I think they were gleaning from the studies that had already been done that might be the case. So I don't know if they've done further work on that, but I just remember that the chief of GCMRC at the time, John Hamill, saying to me, "We're not sure anymore that this predation hasn't affected the population level, and it may not." So given that, and given the position of the tribes, I don't know why you do it.
That's a great story and very illustrative of the core of the adaptive management program is collaboration.
Yeah.
And that's just a wonderful example of effort to collaborate on a difficult topic in which people start out in conflict with each other and come closer to an understanding where people can move forward, everybody can move forward with a sense that their concerns were heard and that decisions were modified to try to have the best possible outcome.
Yeah, it was a real lesson learned for me. First of all, about how scientists can be absolutely sure of something and then change their minds. And so, a healthy skepticism will serve you well. And secondly, such a real world example of traditional ecological knowledge that, people sort of agree with that concept in principle, but I saw it acted out. And it's something that has really informed the way I think about tribal involvement in those kinds of what we think of from our sort of Western scientific point of view as scientifically determined.
Can I ask you, I want to dig a little deeper both on your experiences incorporating the tribes, but also your experiences so you were head of water and science, and the U.S. Geological Survey is kind of the center for collecting the research that supports the AMWIC program, and you were, a representative of one step above them and over them. Can you talk a little bit about what kinds of science were being prioritized when you came in, and whether the kinds of research that was being done evolved or changed over the time that you were there?
Well, I can talk a little bit about it. I'm not sure I can answer the question about an evolution of the science over the time that I was there. The way the AMWIC functioned when I came in was every year the staff of the AMWIC, together with Grand Canyon Monitoring and Research Center, would come up with a budget and work plan. And the budget for the AMWIC comes from two sources, from the Bureau of Reclamation's money for Upper Colorado River operations, but they also get revenues from the power generated by Glen Canyon Dam that goes into the Upper Colorado River Basin Fund. And there's a fixed pot of money that comes out of the Basin Fund every year that funds most of the science through GCMRC. And that was about $10 million a year. So it's a well-funded program with very steady and reliable funding. So it's not subject to the ups and downs of appropriation. That money just comes out of the Basin Fund. So the budget and work plan would rely on the funding from Reclamation, which was a smaller number, and the funding from the Basin Fund. And they needed to fund the staff involved in the operations of the AMWIC, but that's a very small number. Mostly what they were funding was the science. And so they needed to figure out $10 million worth of science every year. And you can fund a lot of science with $10 million a year, especially if you know that it's going to be there year after year after year. So the things they were working on when I came in were like this nearshore ecology study. They were surveying the sandbars because the loss of sandbars from erosion was a big concern, particularly of the Park Service, because the sandbars are where people who float the river camp at night, and if there aren't any sandbars anymore, the whole river recreation is impacted. And not only were the sandbars being eroded, they were being more overtaken by vegetation because the Grand Canyon was not getting the same kind of flood flows that it used to receive before the dam was built. And so the vegetation, whereas it used to be scoured by the spring floods, it was now encroaching farther and farther down into the banks. So they were surveying the sandbars, and there are just a million different studies going on. I mean, I bet at any given time there were 30 line items, budget items of different studies through Grand Canyon Monitoring and Research Center. So all of that had to be figured out every year. And, the AMWAG only meets twice a year. And so one of the meetings would be, here's what we're going to propose for the budget and work plan. And the other one was, okay, now vote on it. And that would take up a lot of time. Yeah, right. And the TWIG, the technical work group, would be involved, but there was also a budget ad hoc group, but it was still way too much. So part of what we did while I was there was to change that to a biennial process from an annual process, and then ultimately to a triennial process, so that you only had to think about it once every 3 years. And there were opportunities to change course in midstream if something wasn't going well or something new needed to be done. But for the most part, it has to be done less frequently now. In terms of evolution, there was this evolution in the thinking about the predation of the non-native fish. I can't remember how that played out in terms of scientific studies. And it seemed like we were always learning more, and it may be one of the best studied reaches of river in the world, but there was always more to investigate and more to learn. Jack Schmidt, when he took over as the chief of GCMRC, was trying to make it more responsive to the needs and expressed desires of the different AMWAG participants. And he certainly did that in terms of reporting. For example, another thing that was going on at the same time as this non-native fish control environmental assessment was we were trying to do the environmental compliance for a protocol for high flow releases from Glen Canyon Dam. Previously, they had 3 different high flow releases. I think in 1994. No, that's not right. Anyhow, 3 of them. Last one was in 2008.
There's a big flood in 1993. Is that
yeah.
what you're thinking of?
No. These I'm talking about intentional high flow releases. So it might have been, I don't know, 94, 98, and 2008, something like that. I know 2 of them were 4 years apart, and then there was a gap. But they had to do independent environmental compliance for each one. And so you had to gin up EIS or an EA and do all the public notice and, have the participating, cooperating agencies and, hearings, and it's a big deal to do environmental compliance like that. And actually, when I first came in to be the Secretary's designee, so this is 2009, there had been a very contentious meeting of the AMWIG in March or April of 2009, at which there was a lot of controversy, and it was about high flow releases and non-native fish control, and the operations of the dam in the fluctuations that are done twice daily to follow the load requirements of the electrical grid. And that March of 2009 meeting resulted in a report to the Secretary that said, here's what we recommend, and a minority report that said, we disagree, and we recommend, Plan B. So one of the things that I did was read those reports before I chaired the first AMWIG meeting in August of that year. And I remember very well, one of the minority reports was written by the Grand Canyon River Guides, who were at the time represented by Andrei Potocnik. And it seemed to me to be a very well-reasoned letter with recommendations. And one of the recommendations in that report was, we need to find a way to do these high flow releases when conditions are right without having to do environmental compliance for each one. And at the time I thought, well, that makes sense. And so it wasn't immediately at that first meeting, but we started to talk about having a protocol for high flow releases. So we would examine the conditions in the river and see how much sediment was residing on the bed of the river. And if there was a lot of sediment that could be spread up higher and replenish the beaches and offset the erosion, then we would do a high flow experiment. So we did the environmental compliance for that protocol, and that remains in place today and allows Reclamation and GCMRC to determine if conditions are right, and if they are, to do a high flow release. And it even has a matrix for the flow rate and duration of the high flow release based on how much sediment they find in the bed. So that was all going on. And the point of this story is that because they were having more regular now high flow releases under the protocol, people were really, really interested to see if it was having an effect on the sandbars and the camping beaches. And, is it doing what it's supposed to do? And so GCMRC, I think, as part of the push to be responsive to the needs of the AMWIG representatives and their agencies, set up cameras that take photos, on some regular basis, and they're looking at sandbars, so they could take before and after pictures. And then GCMRC would publish before and after pictures on their website pretty quickly after a high flow release took place. And then they could monitor it over time and see, okay, well, we replenished this sandbar, but then what happened? Did it last, or did it just get eroded away, and are we doing any good? And so that was just an example of how I saw the science at GCMRC being adapted to be more responsive to operational needs and to measure whether we were succeeding, and whether we should keep going with these experimental treatments.
There's a wonderful website that the GCMRC manages now that collects all of those before and after photos from the different HFEs, the high flow events. And it's very accessible and easy to explore for anybody. It's open to the public, and it's, to me, one of the best examples of making science accessible to the interested public. I love that website.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to me to hear that you were chair of AMWIG at the time when that effort began.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very successful.
Yeah. And they developed, as part of that whole process, they developed a model that would predict the amount of sediment on the bed of the river based on inflows and sediment measurements from the Paria River and the Little Colorado. Yeah, right. So that's something that I think is, maybe unique in the world. I'm not sure. I mean, they didn't have anybody to crib from in building that model.
Okay, this is the second half of my interview with Ann Castle for the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program on March 26th of 2018. So Ann, earlier you were talking about when you came into the program in 2009, there was a little bit of conflict, policy conflicts or position differences between the federal agencies involved in the program, and one of your first tasks was to figure out how to resolve those conflicts or differences. And I was struck by your description of the process that you utilized, which was to get everybody to the table, and including the tribes, and have everybody talk to each other and begin to slowly and incrementally but successfully work out a way forward that everybody could agree to. And it occurred to me that sometimes this is a little bit different than another type of leadership style, which we're familiar with in some federal agencies, in which you have a policy determined from the top, and an executor, an administrator, make sure that everybody down the line is implementing that unified policy direction. And we assume that that's how CEOs manage corporations. That's one style, sort of top-down policy conformance. There's also this sort of bottom-up collaborative process, which the AMWIG itself is kind of a representative of. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the differences between those two management styles, why you chose one over the other in any particular instances, what you see the strengths and weaknesses are of those two different kinds of management styles.
I think that part of the reason for the way that I tried to manage the AMWIG was the condition in which I found it. And the context is important. The Park Service, and when I say the Park Service, that's not really fair, because it wasn't the Park Service as the agency, but Grand Canyon National Park, which was the embodiment of the Park Service involved in the AMWIG, they had felt for the entire George W. Bush administration that they were under siege. And they, I think, in some sense, envisioned themselves as the rebels that were saving the values of the park. So they felt embattled. I think that was part of the reason that they were so at odds with the other federal agencies. And it was partly because the different agencies have different mission descriptions, and they have to do different things. They're trying to get to different goals. And so that natural tension is going to be there. But in this case, it was exacerbated by the politics. And so if I had come in as the Assistant Secretary for Water and Science, being identified with the Bureau of Reclamation and told the Park Service how to behave, that would not have worked. That would have been totally counterproductive. Plus, I'm naturally inclined to value the same things that the Grand Canyon National Park was valuing. And so I wanted to find a way that all the agencies could work together. And plus, I felt that it was inappropriate and unseemly for the different interior agencies to be squabbling with each other in public. And I thought that the federal government should make a better showing than that embodied. And so it was also the change of administration allowed Grand Canyon National Park to be more accepting of the Obama political appointees than they had been of the George W. Bush political appointees. And so I had an opportunity to make peace. And so we instituted these pre-meetings with the federal agencies. And that was an interesting evolution as well, because the AMWAG, let's say the AMWAG meeting would be for 2 days on a Thursday and Friday. So we'd all come in on Wednesday, and the federal agencies would meet, and we'd go through the agenda and figure out how we were going to vote and what we were going to say. And then, in order to facilitate input from the tribes in a setting that they would feel safer in expressing their opinions, we brought the tribes in as part of that meeting with the federal agencies, because one of the communications issues that was communicated to me was that the tribes felt that their opinions were not heard in the greater AMWAG group, and that their positions were dismissed by other AMWAG members. And so we thought that it might be helpful to meet with the tribes just as federal agencies, all of whom bear a trust responsibility to the tribes, to see if we could establish better communication and allow the tribes to be more forthright than they might be comfortable being in the larger group. And then the Western Area Power Administration, also a member of the AMWAG, said, well, hey, wait a minute, we're a federal agency too, and we also have a trust responsibility to the tribes, so why are you just meeting with the interior agencies? So we had this evolutionary process in which we started with just the interior agencies, and then we had interior agencies, and then the tribes came in. And then we had just the interior agencies, then interior plus WAPA, then interior WAPA and the tribes. And we'd all go through this day-long series of meetings, all before the AMWAG meeting started, to get our ducks in a row. And some of that was more successful than other parts. I think getting the interior agencies on the same page was the most successful portion of that.
And these efforts are all being made around particular issues, policy issues. You mentioned the endangered species, chub versus trout in the Colorado River.
Right.
What other issues were sort of the flashpoints for potential conflict and that required more collaboration and discussion?
Permitting, as I mentioned, permitting of the science. And there were some conflicts around who was responsible for doing stuff. So the Park Service has its own science, that Grand Canyon National Park has scientists that do science in the park. And so there were times at which they were concerned that USGS or GCMRC were usurping their responsibilities or overstepping the bounds, maybe duplicating efforts. That was particularly an issue around cultural resources, because the park has a responsibility to maintain cultural resources within the park. And because of tribal concerns, GCMRC had cultural resource experts, archaeologists on staff who were also trying to do cultural resource investigation. And so there was a source of conflict there.
And I imagine the tribes wanted to do their own archaeology and cultural resource studies too.
In some cases, although that didn't seem to raise the same conflict as between the federal agencies.
And if I recall correctly, the superintendent of Grand Canyon National Park during some of that period was Steve Martin.
Right.
Were there other Grand Canyon National Park superintendents that were in during that time period that you were involved?
Yeah, Steve Martin's successor is a guy named Dave Ubaraga, who was very focused on ensuring that Grand Canyon National Park had a good working relationship with the other interior agencies, and in particular with GCMRC. And so he put a lot of effort into understanding what GCMRC wanted to do, needed to do, was being directed to do, what that took in terms of park resources and permitting, and trying to work things out.
So you've mentioned the tribes a number of times. One of the issues that has evolved over the life of the adaptive management program has been increasing and making more meaningful tribal input. Many of the people that we've interviewed have had things to say about that.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else you'd like to say about the role of tribes, how it may have changed over time, the kinds of issues they're most concerned about, and how you were successful in getting their involvement and input on a more meaningful level?
I think that tribes will always have an important role. And it is an interesting dichotomy between the tribal cultural values and this highly Western scientific effort that's going on in GCMRC, and that the majority of the AMWAG members relate to. So I think the sources of that tension will not go away. In addition to having this pre-meeting with the tribes, I also started having lunch with the tribal representatives and whatever tribal members were coming to the AMWAG, because there'd usually be a member and an alternate or a twig member, sometimes tribal members in the audience. So we get all the tribal members together on one of the 2 days of the AMWAG meeting and just have lunch together, and usually without agenda, just to create that relationship and social interaction, which I found very valuable. And I think that at the end of the day, the AMWAG functions as a complex set of relationships. And it was incredibly valuable to me to establish relationships with all the AMWAG members. And I think that's particularly important with the tribal representatives, because the personal relationship is so important in any sort of transaction or activity with a tribe. And so that was all really valuable. And the tribal representatives tended to be pretty long-lived on the AMWAG. And so that provided an opportunity to establish and deepen those relationships And when you have that, there's so much more trust and willingness to compromise, and try to be creative about solutions that, I mean, maybe you don't even have to compromise. Maybe there's a solution that that gets everybody what they need without compromise. But I think if you don't have a personal relationship, that's so much harder to do.
That's a great segue to my next question. I love your statement that the Amway is fundamentally a complicated set of relationships. Our interview with Mary Orton focused a great deal on her efforts to develop those relationships in a way that allowed the organization to move forward as a kind of a team, rather than a whole bunch of individuals fighting for a stake in the outcome. It's more collaboration, and that was her sort of contribution. Can you mention some of the key individuals that you think have been most consequential in that complicated set of relationships, what role they played, and some people who should be called out and remembered for their work?
Well, I think Mary is a good start. She has had an interesting history with the Amway, starting as an Amway member representing American Rivers, and then coming back as a facilitator for a long time, going away for a little while, and then coming back again. So she has institutional knowledge and relationships with a lot of the different generations of Amway members. And I learned a lot from Mary. I learned a lot from her facilitation style, and a component of that was, if we were going to vote on a motion, she would type the motion onto her laptop, project it on a screen, and then we'd fiddle with it real time. And you could do that with suggestions from different Amway members in a less than fully parliamentary procedure type manner that was much more productive. And we'd end up with something that everybody was looking at as a motion that pretty much everybody could vote for, because they had participated in the process of crafting it. And if they had some concern about this word or that phrase, they could get that corrected before we had to put people on paper with their positions. And so I thought that was a really effective device that Mary used. And another thing I learned from Mary was that she would sort of scan the room and figure out if somebody was looking unhappy but wasn't saying anything, and she'd make them say something. And we developed a really nice working relationship because Mary had, for other chairs, I think, taken more of the I'm going to run this meeting role. And the person who was the secretary's designee was there to make decisions and kind of provide the big picture, but wasn't necessarily running the meeting. But I ran the meeting, but Mary could facilitate the meeting. And that freed her up to be able to figure out who was mad but wasn't talking, and tell me, and we could get that person to express their viewpoint and adjust the process accordingly. So I felt like we had kind of a good team thing going on. But I think Mary's style is very inclusive, and she tries to make sure that people aren't left behind. And that I think is key to a functional group where people feel like they're contributing, that they're not being ignored. and they're part of this collective effort. And you're right, that's what we were really trying to create. Okay, we got a problem here. We got a dam that didn't exist before, and it's upstream of one of the most iconic parks in the world. How are we going to solve that problem collectively? And yes, we have different missions and different constituencies to respond to, but let's work on it. Let's work on it together. And so that was.
Do you think it was reasonably successful during your time there?
I like to think so, and partly because there had been all this conflict and controversy and divided votes and litigation at the beginning, and toward the end of the time I was there, I think all the votes I remember were consensus votes without dissension. So we'd come to these decisions collectively. Now, one of the things we did as an experiment, and I'm not sure if it's still going on, but this is another interesting evolution. So as I said, when I first started, the federal agencies are spatting with each other and voting differently. And I said, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to figure out how we're all voting, and then we're all voting that way. The other AMWIG members, particularly the states, had been the most vocal about what's going on with these federal agencies. They're voting in different directions. We don't know what the secretary thinks. How are we supposed to figure that out? And then when we all started voting the same way, they said, well, we don't know what the federal agencies are thinking, because you all go in a room together and you figure out what you're going to say, and then you do it, and we don't know who's thinking what. So that was whatever you do, damned if you do, damned if you don't, I guess. But so there was a suggestion that if the federal agencies were going to all vote the same way, then why should they vote? Why should they be voting members? Which is not as weird as it might sound at first, because it's really unusual to have federal agencies as voting members of a federal advisory committee, which is what the AMWIG is. So it's a committee that's set up to advise the secretary. Presumably the secretary can get advice from the Park Service or USGS or whichever independently. And so we decided to try as an experiment that the federal agencies would be non-voting members. And that was implemented about midway through my time as the chair of the AMWIG. And as I said, some people liked it, some people didn't. It gave the federal agencies some freedom, though. And we were explicit at the time that the agencies, the interior agencies, weren't going to vote, but they were still going to fully participate, and they were going to make their views known, so that AMWIG members with less time and resources to invest in the program would get the benefit of the expertise and the insight from the federal folks who were, immersed in these issues as part of their jobs. And so that was a little bit of a struggle, but that was what we were trying to do. So going back to the question of who was influential, so Mary, I would say, but I really think that there were contributions from so many quarters. The reclamation folks had to think outside of their traditional box, which is water operations. How are we going to manage this dam to get the water where it's supposed to be and generate electricity? Because that's what creates revenue. They had to go outside that and think, yes, we have endangered species responsibilities, but we're all part of Interior, and we want to preserve Grand Canyon National Park. And how do we do that? And how do we honor the tribes? And And so I think there had to be a considerable evolution in the analysis, the sort of internal analysis that the reclamation folks went through. And that had been occurring over many years since really the enactment of the Grand Canyon Protection Act, but it was happening in real time while I was there, and I could see it happening. Ann Gold was the deputy regional director of the Upper Colorado region, and she was the reclamation AMWAG member for many years, and she was terrific in terms of her ability to understand the positions of other AMWAG members and try to work with people to figure out a constructive path forward. The folks at GCMRC were very responsive, and under Jack's leadership, I think particularly so, to not only let's do science that makes a difference to real people on the ground, but let's get our results out there. Let's not make sure that we've got 30 peer reviews and 87 spell checks before we release something. Let's get it out as soon as we can, understanding and informing people that this may not be final because it hasn't gone through peer review, but people want to see this stuff. They don't want to wait for 3 years. And so that was a huge hurdle for USGS scientists to jump, but they were able to work on that and turn their results around much more quickly than they had before. The Park Service, I think, was also under Dave Ubaraga's leadership very accommodating in ways that they had not always been. And Jan Balsam, who was the chief scientist for Grand Canyon National Park, was really, really helpful in dealing with those tricky cultural resource issues and working with reclamation to reach an agreement on historic preservation that was part of what had to be done during the time that I was there.
We just arranged to interview Jan Balsam sometime in the next year, so
Good.
I'm looking forward to that. I know she's been involved as a liaison with the tribes for Grand Canyon National Park for decades, so she'll have great insight.
Yeah, she does. Yeah.
During the 4 or so years that you were involved, were there any really significant events that happened? Like sometimes there'll be a massive flood that changes everything, like in 1983, 84, or a crash in an endangered species population or terrible fire. Was there anything that happened, some event that happened that sticks out in your mind as significant during your tenure?
It was 5.5 years that I was there.
Thank you.
Probably the most significant things that happened were the high flow releases. And having the protocol in place to be able to do them really quick turnaround was pretty awesome. And so,
were you doing them annually by that time?
Almost.
That's a big difference from prior.
Yeah, absolutely. But interestingly, I mean, nature always throws a curveball, right? And there was one time that they were all ginned up to do a high flow release, and all of a sudden there was a green catfish problem below the dam. And green catfish are apparently even more of a threat to endangered species than trout, like by an order of magnitude. And there was some concern that doing a high flow release with these green catfish in the system was going to really upend the ecosystem. And they didn't have much science on the green catfish, and so they didn't know what would happen. As a result of that, though, the high flow release for that particular year didn't happen. And so it was, I think that was right after I left, but I knew about it. It was in the works when I was still there. It was just a lesson on adaptive management, right?
Yeah.
You have no idea what's going to happen. You can't predict all these things, and you have to be nimble.
That's an interesting anecdote. I wonder if they engaged in the same kind of fish control shocking and killing that you were suggesting for trout.
I don't think they did. I really don't think they've done electroshocking in the Upper Canyon since like 2010, something like that. Secretary Salazar came to the first high flow release under the protocol. And I think I went to 3 of them.
Is it like a party? Does everybody gather at the dam? And
totally like a party, because it's a good news story, right? You know, the media's all there, and everybody supports. There's nobody who doesn't want it to happen, and well, with minor exceptions, but there's always an exception.
It took a while to get to that consensus.
It
did. There was controversy for a long time.
It did, and you know, I got to turn the valve to open the bypass tubes. Yeah, it's pretty exciting stuff.
Do you have any pictures of that?
Oh yeah.
Maybe you can send us a picture of you with the valve.
Okay.
Nice supplement.
Okay, I have a wonderful picture that's one of the ones I treasure from Interior, and I think it's from the first high flow release under the protocol. And there are 6 of us who are standing on the little concrete pathway right above the bypass tubes, which is what they open to create the high flow release. So there's tubes that are a little bit bigger in diameter than this room, so maybe 15 feet in diameter, and they are shooting water. You know, maybe the water is coming out with such velocity that it shoots out maybe 20, 25 feet horizontally before it falls into the river. And so this picture has the Commissioner of Reclamation, Mike Connor, our solicitor, Bob Snow, who works on all sorts of Colorado River legal issues, the operator from the Bureau of Reclamation, Katrina Grants, my deputy, Lori Karamanian, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, Jane Leiter, and the bypass tubes are shooting water behind us, and we all signed the picture. It's great.
I'd love to have a copy of that.
Okay.
That'd be great. Next question. What do you think during your term, what do you think you were able to accomplish, and what did you want to do that maybe you weren't able to accomplish?
Well, I certainly wanted to correct what I saw was dysfunction in the AMWAG when I first arrived. I wanted to hopefully get rid of the litigation, and ultimately that litigation was resolved by dismissal. And I wanted to resolve the discord among the interior agencies. And I wanted to involve the tribes in a more meaningful way. And I think we moved toward all of those goals. I didn't know when I came in that I wanted to have a high flow release protocol, but I figured that out, and we got that done. And I think that together with the non-native fish control program, those two things together were significant steps forward in managing the operations of Glen Canyon Dam in a way that was responsive to environmental concerns, endangered species concerns, and tribal concerns. So I feel good about that. But there's always more to do. When I left, we were working on the long-term experimental and management plan, the LTEMP. That wasn't finished until after I left. I was hoping that it would be finished while I was there. The previous long-term plan had been finalized. It had been talked about, and I think finalized in the early 2000s. It was time to do another one and to incorporate all the scientific lessons we had learned and incorporate things like the protocol and the non-native fish control program, and to set the stage for the next 15 years or so of operations. So I was disappointed that I didn't get to see that one through, but it got done, and now is in place. I think there are many federal advisory committees that their goal is to see themselves go out of business because that advice is no longer required. They've given the advice that was requested, and now you don't need them anymore. I don't know that applies to the AMWAG, partly because our science is always evolving, and the nature of the river is changing. Climate change is reducing flows. There will be, at some point, different agreements about the operations of Lake Powell and Glen Canyon Dam to deliver water from the upper basin to the lower basin. That will mean different impacts in the Grand Canyon, and the AMWAG needs to advise the Secretary about their interests in those impacts. So I think that it isn't and shouldn't be a goal of this group to put themselves out of business. The nature of the problems will evolve. The direction that the federal agencies are getting from their political leadership will change over time, and they need to hear from the interests that the AMWAG represents about how their constituencies view the operations of Glen Canyon Dam and how their interests are being affected. So I think that need will continue to exist. And the fact that they've got different problems to deal with now than they did when I first started, that's great. Different people will be involved, different tribal representatives, different state representatives, and all of that is the mix that was intended when the Grand Canyon Protection Act was enacted in 1992 and said the Secretary will get advice from these different interests about these operations. That's what the AMWAG is doing, and I think it's a really important function and one that needs to continue.
Yeah, that's a very compelling argument for the value of the program and why it should continue. Do you think that there is any structural element to the adaptive management program that could be improved? Are there any weaknesses in how the program is, how representatives are selected, how decisions are made, the connection between science and policy? Is there anything that you see as a continuing weakness that might be focused on to strengthen the value of the program over time?
One of the things that I had been concerned about when I was at Interior was the Grand Canyon Protection Act says that the Secretary will seek advice from these different listed interests that include the states and the tribes and recreation and environmental, scientific, and academic. And there's not a designated academic member of the AMWIG. And we thought about whether the charter should be changed to include that. There was some thought that the science advisors, through Dave Garrett at the time, served that academic function.
David Braun now.
Okay.
I would think that he would kind of serve that function, but maybe not.
Yeah, and should that be a different status than all the rest of the AMWIG members? I don't know the answer to that, but it was something that I was a little concerned about. The role of the science advisors was always a little murky to me. And so that was, I guess that was part of why I was concerned, because I wasn't sure exactly what the charge of the science advisors was. So that's something that I think could be considered. If you start changing, especially increasing the number of people on the AMWIG, everybody gets worried that their votes are diluted. And so it's a political discussion. It would have to be thoroughly vetted. So that's an issue. I remember it being raised when I was there that the state representatives on the AMWIG are usually the highest ranking state water official that's been designated by the governor. So Tom Bushatsky, or the director of the Water Conservation Board in Colorado, or the state engineer in Wyoming. And sometimes they'll send their designees, their deputies, or whoever. But the member is usually the state water official. At least that was true, well, most of the time I was there. And then the recreational, or usually the recreational representative, might own a bait shop at Page. And so the concern was expressed that we didn't have parity among the members. I don't worry about that. I think that's okay. Because I think that you don't want somebody on the board of American Rivers talking about going to AMWIG meetings and sort of representing the recreational community. You want the guy from the bait shop who's right there on the ground. And so that was not a concern that I had. Trying to think of anything else structurally. It was hard having meetings in Phoenix in August. And those are actually required by the charter.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I thought Phoenix was just a good airport hub, but it's actually in the charter.
Yeah. But we ignored it and had meetings in Flagstaff in August.
They still do occasionally.
Yeah.
I
used to get worried about people just wandering around at 117 degrees. Yep.
Are you hopeful about the future of the program?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a great program. I think, in my experience, the work of the AMWIG is listened to in the halls of Interior. I think it serves as an outlet for some of the controversies that might otherwise erupt in more unproductive ways. I am definitely hopeful about the future. I also think that everybody who serves on the AMWIG for any significant period of time establishes relationships with all the other people who are AMWIG members, and a lot of the sort of group that sits around the table, if not at the table. And those relationships are productive in so many ways that we can't even predict. For the environmental representatives to have a personal relationship and go out for margaritas with the head of the state water agency in the state where their operations are located, that has benefits well beyond the operations of Glen Canyon Dam, and I think it's really, really important, and just a good incubator for good things to happen because of those relationships in water operations throughout the basin.
You mentioned earlier in the interview the impact of climate change on water supplies in the Colorado River Basin. I'm sure you already know Lake Mead is about a third full, and Glen Canyon Dam is less than half full, and are around
60%.
About 60% now.
Mm-hmm.
And none of them have been full for a while, and climatologists are not expecting, or hydrologists aren't expecting them to be much full. So there's suddenly some discussion now about how long into the future Glen Canyon Dam and Lake Powell are even viable. Do you ever think about that? Does it trouble you? This is a long-term program.
Mm-hmm.
What's your thoughts on the possible impact on the program and the Colorado River Basin as a whole under current conditions of drought and climate change?
Yeah, well, there's absolutely no question but that climate change is affecting flows in the river, and the best and most recent scientific evidence is that effect will be much more drastic in the years to come. 35% maybe reduction in flows by the next century. Huge numbers. And that kind of possible future has to spark pretty intense conversations about how we're going to manage this river differently if we're only getting 60-70% of the flows that we're accustomed to on average, and that will affect Glen Canyon Dam. As you know, there's a proposal called Fill Mead First that would put all available water into Lake Mead and only use Powell if there was excess. You've talked to Jack Schmidt, but he's investigated that most recently. And the idea is, of course, that if you only have one big water surface, there's less evaporation overall, less water loss overall than if you have two big water surfaces, Lake Powell and Lake Mead. But there are other factors at work, and the Jack's analysis, which is the most recent, seems to indicate that the projected water savings are not nearly as substantial as might have originally been thought. There was some science done in 2011 that suggested that 300,000 acre-feet a year could be saved if you followed the Fill Mead First protocol. Jack's analysis suggests that it might be on the order of 50,000 acre-feet. And in my opinion, that's not enough to justify the really intense brain damage and congressional uproar that it would require to do a fill meet first protocol. But this is an area where we don't have the scientific data we need to reach well-informed conclusions. And we need more information about evaporation from both of the lakes. We need more information about seepage from Lake Powell in particular. We need more information about the potential impact of not having a storage reservoir at Lake Powell on the downstream ecosystems, particularly in the Grand Canyon. I think that if there's some potential to save 300,000 acre-feet in a river where we're spending millions of dollars to save 10,000 acre-feet, that if there's that potential, then the scenario needs to be investigated. I don't think it's justified by anything we've seen currently, but we need to develop the data to be able to do that analysis and reach more definitive conclusions.
Do you think we need another adaptive management program working group authorized by Congress to deal with the larger issues of basin storage and water allocation and climate change? Or do you think the current AMWIC could take that on? It's so much bigger than its original charter, but this is science that needs to be done and collaborative decision making. Who would do that?
The bigger challenge about adjusting to reduced flows is, in the first instance, a discussion that needs to be had among the states, the 7 basin states, with Interior.
Revisit the Colorado River Compact, you mean, 1922?
No, I don't mean that.
No, you don't mean that.
No, I'm talking about primarily the interim guidelines. And the interim guidelines were put in place in 2007, designed to be effective through 2026. But the Secretary of the Interior is required to start consultation on renewal or the next iteration of the guidelines by no later than the end of 2020. That's not that far away. And so the states need to be involved in those discussions. The drought contingency planning that's taking place in all of the basin states, but most intensely in the lower basin, is part of that. And the DCP discussions will probably morph into the reconsultation under the interim guidelines. I think that there's enough flexibility in the 1922 compact so that it doesn't need to be revised, but the operational implementation of the 1922 compact needs to evolve based on climate change and increased demands. So, but that's something that the states have to deal with in the first instance. And I can tell you that the states would be very concerned about having an advisory committee with any sort of power around that discussion.
Do you think that the drought contingency plans in place now could potentially have an effect on the ability of the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program to continue its high flow event experimental high flows and continue its research and its work? Is there any potential for water shortages to undermine the continuation of the program, in your opinion?
Oh, I think decisions around the drought contingency plan and how that plays out ultimately can have an effect on operations. I don't think it'll affect the high flow experiments, probably not, because the way the dam has to be operated for water delivery is on an annual basis. And so they can jigger around with the timing, and the high flow releases are part of that. So even with diminished releases, they should be able to do high flow releases. Maybe not as high, but even then, it's just a question of how the timing of the releases works during the year. It doesn't have to affect the annual deliveries. And that's an important point. That was something people would be concerned. Well, you're wasting water. You're sending upper basin water to the lower basin, you don't need to. And we'd say, no, they're getting only the amount of water that they're entitled to. We're just retiming it. So I think there's no reason why you wouldn't be able to do that still. And there's an energy cost to those high flow releases because you're bypassing the turbines. And so you lose the energy production that would have occurred had you released that water in a more uniform way. In the overall scheme of things, that's a relatively small loss compared to the annual revenue that's produced by the turbines. But that, because it's non-carbon energy, that may be a concern in the future, not wasting a drop of water that could be used to produce hydropower. That's a balance. That's been a balance that the system and the AMWEG had to consider from the beginning. So, climate change is having an impact on the basin as a whole, and that's going to continue and become more dramatic. But, I think that's another reason why the AMWEG needs to continue, so that all those diverse voices understand the impacts of climate change on their particular constituencies and interests and are able to advise the Secretary.
Great. Last question. What advice would you give an incoming member of AMWEG, somebody new coming onto the team? What would be your best advice as they launch their participation in the program?
Form relationships with the fellow AMWEG members. People have been coming in new for as long as the AMWEG has existed. So there are a lot of acronyms, there's a lot of legend, there's a lot of institutional history that may feel intimidating to a new member. But pretty much everybody there has been in that position at one time, and I found that people are proud of the AMWEG history and are more than willing to help educate new members. But it's the creation of relationships with your fellow AMWEG members that will have the most lasting effect and enable you to represent your constituencies in the most effective way and communicate on a personal level what the concerns are, what the interests are, and be able to work with other members at that personal level to create mutually beneficial solutions.
Thank you so much, Anne. It was a wonderful conversation. I appreciate you taking time to do this.
You're welcome. My pleasure.